Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. I'd like to thank Rachel Wilson for joining us today. Rachel spent 15 years as the National Security Agency, where she ran counterterrorism operations, worked cybersecurity threats to the 2012 Summer Olympics in London, and spent 5 years leading NSA's cyber exploitation operations mission. As the senior committing official for NSA's hacking mission, she oversaw the planning and execution of thousands of cyber operations against America's adversaries. In the spring of 2017, Rachel became the first head of cybersecurity for Morgan Stanley Wealth Management. In this role, she leverages her experience in attacking and defending high-consequence systems to protect Morgan Stanley and its clients from cyber actors. I have had the pleasure of hearing Rachel speak on this topic and found myself both intrigued and terrified all at the same time. And you all are about to see what I mean. Please take it from here, Rachel.
Margaret, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I hope all of you find today's comments interesting. Terrifying is optional, but I take your point, Margaret. Well made. So as Margaret said, I'm Rachel Wilson. I'm currently the head of cybersecurity for Morgan Stanley's wealth management business, which means that in essence, I'm responsible for the security of 600 branches around the country, 17,000 financial advisors leveraging our technology, and about 1,000 applications that we run and field to both our employees and to our clients. I've been in that job for 3 years, and as Margaret mentioned, I came to that job after 15 years at the National Security Agency. In my 15 years at the NSA, as Margaret mentioned, I spent a couple of years running the NSA's counterterrorism operations mission. This was during the Times Square bombing, the Detroit underwear bombing, some pretty exciting times. Then I spent a couple of years in the UK working out of the American Embassy, helping the British get ready for the 2012 Summer Olympics. As you would expect, we had a large number of terrorist plots to those Olympics, but for me and the Americans on site, we were really focused on the cybersecurity threats to those Olympics. So this was everything from the Chinese trying to hack into the clocks, the timers at the Olympic venues, the Russians trying to hack into the databases that housed the Olympic drug testing records, which makes perfect sense now and was very confusing to us at the time, to just general miscreants looking to rub some grit in the eyes of the British leading into those Olympics. I was thrilled to see them go off without a hitch and then to return home to suburban Maryland, where NSA is headquartered, to spend my last 5 years at the NSA in my dream job, Margaret. So what you described, running NSA's hacking mission, leading the organization that is planning and executing thousands of operations all over the world against our adversaries, stealing the secrets out of their networks, giving them to our policymakers, our war fighters, all with the goal of keeping America and her allies safe. I would have done that job forever. It was truly the best job I've ever had, but those of you who have worked in government know that's not how government works. And so after a few years, they want you to do something else. And so I decided that I was going to leave government and that I was going to come to Wall Street, which as was a big change. But it's been interesting over these last 3 years at Morgan Stanley to see how much the cyber risk landscape has changed and how much it has grown. And that's a lot of what we are going to talk about this afternoon. So in the next 40 minutes, I want to give you a sense in my capacity, what sorts of cyber risks and threats keep me up at night in this job? What am I losing sleep over? And then I want to talk about it from all of your perspective. As all of the folks joining us in this webinar today, you wear many different hats, right? You have corporate leadership roles. Some of you are serving on boards of directors. Some of you are philanthropists or working for nonprofits in your own capacity. And then of course, all of us as individuals face cyber threats. And so I want to talk about the cyber risks that we face wearing all of those many hats. And I want to give you some cybersecurity best practices, some things that we can all be doing to be safer citizens on the internet. Now, in frankness, Margaret, and you know this, I don't have any hope or expectation that everyone who has joined us today is going to do all of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of cyber risk mitigation. My hope, in all frankness, is that everyone who's with us today chooses one thing that they're going to do differently. I tell people all the time, cybersecurity is not about perfection. It's really about not being the sickest gazelle in the herd. So that is my hope, is that if all of us pick one thing to do differently, we're all going to run a little bit faster in the herd, we will be safer citizens on the internet. And then, of course, I would be remiss this afternoon if I didn't also mention all of the circumstances around coronavirus. And so we're going to talk about that as well. This is timely, this is important. Just as coronavirus has changed our medical landscape, our health landscape, our financial landscape, certainly, it has also changed the cybersecurity landscape. Things are different than they were a month ago, and we'll talk about some of the cyber risks that have cropped up specifically around the pandemic. All right, so with that, at the highest levels, I would tell you that as the head of cybersecurity for a financial services firm, the cyber threat that has kept me up at night most for the last year has been, without a doubt, the North Koreans. Why North Korea? Well, of course, the North Koreans are up against staunch international sanctions. They have no domestic economy to speak of, and yet they're trying to fund a wildly expensive missile and nuclear program. So how are they doing this? How is North Korea funding its government in 2020? Well, they've essentially made it a plank of their national strategy that they're going to fund their government by hacking into banks and stealing money. It really is that simple. The old adage, why rob banks? It's where the money is. It's what they're doing. We just never expected to see a nation state, a country, take this on as their source of gross domestic product. What's unfortunate for all of us playing defense in financial services is that the North Koreans have resourced their bank hacking strategy at a very high level. So estimates now have it at 7,000 people within the North Korean government who have bank hacking as their full-time job. And those ranks continue to grow. I tell my kids all the time how fortunate they are to not be growing up in North Korea, although I think there are times they think having me as a mom might feel similar. But my latest reason for they should be grateful they did not grow up in the DPRK is that the North Koreans have implemented a new national strategy whereby every 11-year-old child is administered an aptitude test. You score best and brightest on the North Korean aptitude test, you're immediately on-ramped into the bank hacking program. Taken away from your family, moved into a dormitory, trained to be a bank hacker, raised in the hacking culture from the age of 11. Also unfortunate for us, the North Koreans are pretty darn good at this bank hacking. So some of you will be familiar with the Bank of Bangladesh heist. This goes back a few years where the North Koreans successfully hacked into the Central Bank of Bangladesh and carted off close to $100 million. What people do not know about that particular heist, though, is that the North Koreans were a typographical error away, a spelling mistake away from that being close to $1 billion. These are non-trivial dollar sums they're going after, and that this was not a one-off for the North Koreans. This is their national strategy for funding their government. And in fact, the United Nations last year released a report supporting the allegations of 17 different countries around the world, all of whom are alleging that the North Koreans have hacked part of their central banking infrastructure to the tune of close to $3 billion over this time period. So lots to be worried about there. But as much as North Korea has dominated my sleepless nights over the last year, for the last few months, my greatest concern has actually been Iran. Why? So Iran has figured out what we've long known, which is that cyber represents an asymmetric threat, that building a nuclear weapon is difficult, that sailing an aircraft carrier into New York Harbor is probably a 10-year project, but that they can and have put 40 guys in the basement of a building in Tehran and managed to wreak havoc on Wall Street. If you go back to the 2012 to 2014 timeframe, I can now tell you the Iranians were conducting what we call distributed denial of service attacks all up and down Wall Street, going bank to bank to bank, conducting these attacks. And actually in December of 2012, the Iranians went up against the NASDAQ. And the attacks they conducted were so severe that the NASDAQ actually had to shut down. It could not trade for multiple days. And so what we expected to see when we pulled out of the nuclear agreement with Iran, when we came this close to being at war with Iran in January, was frankly exactly what we saw, and that was a dramatic upswing in Iranian cyber attacks against the US financial sector, representing, again, retaliation for either economic sanctions, for loss of life, for military actions, all in this asymmetric fashion. All right, next thing I want to make sure we talk about is a level below these nation states, but not far below. And this is the threat around what I would call cyber criminal syndicates. So think of these as traditional organized crime rings that are now using cyber means to conduct their crimes. And what's fascinating about the tradecraft that we see these cyber criminal syndicates using, it actually looks a lot like the tradecraft that we see from nation states like North Korea, which might be surprising until you think for a minute about how much those North Korean government hackers are getting paid, right? Next to nothing. They are getting paid pittance. There's no money in North Korean government hacking. And so what do we see those hackers doing? Well, they're taking second jobs. They're moonlighting as hackers for hire nights and weekends. And we see this not just in North Korea, but in Russia, in China, all across Eastern Europe, hackers that work for their government by day and then work as hackers for hire nights and weekends. Now, as a hacker for hire, I might be working for another government on contract. I might be working as a hacktivist. These are hackers that hack for political reasons. I'll tell you, I didn't think I was going to be worried about hacktivists in this job, but hacktivists are opposed to the financial system in many cases, and so banks routinely see attacks from hacktivists. Some of these guys, though, are working for these cyber criminal syndicates. And in these cases, they are conducting traditional organized crime, but now via cyber means and at a global scale. At a level below these cyber criminal syndicates, we've seen a rise over the last 3 years in traditional fraud, but now enabled with cyber means. So this is now fraud at a scope, scale, and velocity that exceeds what we could have imagined even a few years ago. What might this cyber-enabled fraud look like? Well, imagine a hacker goes out to the dark web. That's just the part of the internet that's not indexed. You can't get there through a Google search. Hacker goes to the dark web, though, and buys 10 million credential pairs. Now, credential pair is just a login and password. These logins and passwords have nothing to do with your bank. These are the logins and passwords from the Home Depot breach, the Target breach, LinkedIn, Yahoo, all of these companies that have been hacked over the last few years. The hacker goes after the database that houses all of the logins and passwords, steals them, dumps them all for sale on the dark web, sells them pennies on the dollar. Now, why does the hacker want all of these old logins and passwords from LinkedIn? Well, the hacker knows that many of us tend to be victims of that particular form of human frailty that causes us to reuse the same password across multiple websites. We know we shouldn't do this because if we use the same password everywhere and it gets compromised anywhere, we're at risk everywhere we've used it. But passwords are a pain, and we'll talk more about how to better manage our passwords. That said, that's what the hacker is hoping, is that maybe the same password you were using at Yahoo years ago is the one you're using for your bank account. So he's going to take those millions of credential pairs and he's going to throw them all against your bank's front door just to see what sticks. Now, how is he going to do this? Because if he did it manually, he'd be fat fingering in those logins and passwords for the rest of his life. So what does he do to speed up the process? He goes back to the dark web and rents a botnet. A botnet, simply thousands of highly hackable endpoint devices. These are your Internet of Things type devices, smart TVs, smart toasters even now, things that typically have manufacturer default credentials, where I as the hacker can very easily script up an attack and have all of these devices do my bidding simultaneously. And that's what we see in these cases. Thousands of devices throwing millions of credential pairs against a bank's authentication gateway. Now, the botnet is not smart. All it returns is a simple thumbs up, thumbs down. Vast majority of cases, thumbs down. This login and password do not work for any customer of this financial institution. But for that small but non-zero percentage that return a thumbs up, that's when we see that fraudster logging into those accounts, setting up bill payments, money movements, all the kinds of things you would expect to see a traditional fraudster do if they got access to your bank account. Moral of the story, of course, is not to use the same login and password across multiple websites, and it's ideally to use stronger forms of authentication, never relying on simply a username and password to secure any of our high consequence accounts. And we'll talk more about authentication all along these lines. The last risk in terms of things that keep me up at night in this job for the last year has been around mobile malware. So this is malicious software that's targeting the mobile applications on your phone. The one maybe that's caused me the most sleepless nights is a particular strain of malware out there called Marcher, which has been targeting financial services and banking applications around the United States for the last 2 years. The way that Marcher works, it starts by socially engineering us into downloading this malware onto our phones. Now, none of us would knowingly download malware, right? But sadly, it does not come with a skull and crossbones on it. It is not clearly malicious. Instead, it's always going to present itself as something benign, something innocuous. Maybe as a software update, maybe as a game. Marcher in particular loves to pretend to be solitaire. So you think you're downloading solitaire onto your phone, now you have this malware on your phone. The next thing it's going to do is socially engineer you into giving it admin level privileges on your device, so a deep level of access to your phone. How will it get these privileges? Well, it will simply ask us for them. You think about it, we all download apps, right? And they want a lot from you. They want access to your contacts and your location and your photos, and we just click yes, 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 because we want to get on with using the app. Hopefully we don't do that. But if we did that in this case, we would give Marcher admin level privileges on our phone, which is what's going to come back to bite us. Now, I don't know I have malware on my phone, so I launch my mobile banking application. Marcher detects that I have launched my mobile banking app, and it throws up an overlay on top of my mobile banking application that looks exactly like what I'm expecting to see. Same colors, same branding, completely identical, but of course commanded and controlled by the hacker fraudster on the back end. I don't know this. I think this is my mobile banking app, so I enter my username and password. Now my username and password are compromised. But it's actually what happens next that is most insidious about these, because what is the fraudster going to do with my username and password for my bank account? Well, he's going to attempt to log into my account on his device. But your bank is smart enough to recognize this as a suspicious login, right? We're going to see this is not Rachel's IP address. This is not the device she has registered with us. This is not the location she usually logs in from. And what do we do when we detect a suspicious login, right? We send you that 6-digit passcode text message. You've got to enter that in on your computer to prove that you are who you say you are. What's the problem with that text message in this case? Hacker's on my phone. I gave the hacker admin level privileges to my device, which means he has access to my text message queue, steals that text message out of my queue, uses it to meet my bank step-up authentication challenge, and potentially off to the races committing fraud in my account. Now, fortunately, banks have done a great job combating this, but this is the spectrum of risk in financial services that we are dealing with today. Now, I want to pivot here and talk a little bit about risks to businesses writ large, because when we look across the country and when we look globally, cyber crimes have never been more lucrative than they have been in the last 12 months. Cyber criminals are doing well for themselves. The ingenuity that they're applying, if these guys and gals would just use their powers for good, I'm sure they'd be wealthy in their own right. They're just unfortunately using them for ill. And the two risks that we have seen most broadly in the last year to businesses across the United States, the first has been around ransomware. We've all seen the media coverage of these attacks. This is where a hacker gets into your network via some means and finds out what you care about most. What is the data, the system, the application, the service that is business critical for you? He again gets into that system, that service, that database, and irrevocably encrypts it such that it can no longer be used. This might be your computer, it might be a database, it might be a back-end system. Next thing you receive, of course, is a ransom note, an email saying that if you would like your data back, you need to send X dollars in Bitcoin equivalent. What happens when you send that cryptocurrency? You get a little bit of your data back, and you get another email that says if you would like more of your data back, please send us another Y dollars in equivalent cryptocurrency. These are bad attacks for many reasons, and the two things that we need to be doing to make sure that we do not fall victim to ransomware attacks, the first is all about keeping our systems fully patched and up to date. This is our desktops, the operating systems we run, our browsers, the apps on our phones, keeping them all fully patched. And by a patch, I simply mean a software update. You all get these software updates all the time, where whether it's Windows or Mac or Apple, they're telling you, you have a software update. What these software manufacturers are doing, they are constantly discovering new flaws and bugs and vulnerabilities in their code. And they're fixing those vulnerabilities for us as their consumers, and they're sending us those fixes in the form of that patch, that software update. Critically important when we get that patch that we go ahead and let it execute as soon as it comes in. Because when that patch is released, we enter into a race condition with the hackers. For us, That patch is the solution to the security vulnerabilities we didn't even know we had. But for the hackers, that patch is an opportunity. If they can reverse engineer that patch, discover the underlying vulnerabilities that it mitigates, and weaponize those vulnerabilities against those who have not yet patched, they're going to have a great day. Again, for us playing defense, we've got to make sure that we execute that patch so that we are immunized against those vulnerabilities and they can't be used against us. The other thing that we can be doing to help around ransomware attacks is to ensure that all of our critical data and systems are backed up, and that they're backed up in a meaningful way and in a way that we have practiced restoring from backups. So many clients that I've talked to in the last year who have fallen victim to ransomware attacks discovered that even though their data was backed up, they had never practiced, they had never exercised the process of restoring from backups, and those backups were essentially lost to them. Lastly, we and the federal government don't recommend paying a ransom. In fact, ransomware attacks became so lucrative last year that there's now federal legislation pending that would make it illegal to pay a ransom, because of course, every time we pay, we further incentivize this kind of hacking activity. The other risk that we've seen businesses fall prey to over the last year is the risk around business email compromise. This is where a hacker gets access to either your business email account, maybe your personal email account, or sets up an email account that looks very, very similar to yours, that maybe a less nuanced observer would expect to be you, then uses your email account or a spoofed email account that looks like yours to email other people initiating money movements and transactions in your name. You can imagine what that looks like for me in the form of clients who have their email accounts compromised, and then all of a sudden we're receiving emails requesting wire instructions, requesting money movements that appear to be coming from the client, but are in fact coming from their hacked account or from this spoofed account. The bottom line here is that we want to be very skeptical of anything we receive in email, never initiating transactions, money movements, any kind of movement whatsoever based on purely an email. We want to make sure that we're applying some additional form of check before we go ahead and execute any kind of instruction based on email alone. In addition, we want to make sure that our email accounts are strongly protected. And this is where authentication technology becomes really important. If we take a step back and we think about authentication, simply how we verify that we are who we say we are as we interact with others, both in person and online, all forms of authentication fall into one of three bins. The first bin is something that you know. So this is going to be your password, your mother's maiden name, your social security number, your date of birth, maybe the make and model of your first car, those secret questions that folks like to ask. The problem with this knowledge-based authentication over the past few years, with the breaches that companies have experienced and with 10 years of our lives now in social media, is that the efficacy of this secrets-based authentication has plummeted as a result of these things not being so secret anymore, which is why you see firms pivoting to stronger forms of authentication. The second of which is something that you have. So for lots of people, that's your trusted device. We ask you to register your smartphone, your tablet, your laptop or desktop with us. Then when we see an individual logging in from that device that they've declared as trusted, we can be doubly confident that you are who you say you are. You're presenting both something that you know in the form of that password and something that you have in the form of that trusted device or that physical token. Together, this is what we call multi-factor authentication. It's where we want to be for all of our sensitive logins, including our logins to our email accounts and all of the juicy, lucrative information that they contain about us. The third form of authentication, of course, is something that you are. This is where biometrics come into play. This is Face ID, this is fingerprints, retinal scans, voice recognition technology. These can be great, strong authenticators because they are inherent to you. And so again, using these strong forms of authentication to protect your email accounts in the same way that you would protect perhaps your banking account, really important in a world where business email compromise has become so lucrative. All right, at this point, I want to pivot to talk a little bit about coronavirus and what it looks like for all of us in terms of cybersecurity risk. Just in the same way that we've seen nation states leverage misinformation and disinformation in the past, we certainly see that going on in the coronavirus environment. So just in the same way that the Russians sought to interfere or influence the 2016 presidential elections, we're seeing them take those same steps via social media and online propaganda today. Essentially, Russia is pushing fake news to the West using contradictory, confusing, malicious statements to make it very difficult for Western governments to communicate their response to the pandemic, and really with the goal of sowing panic in the West. We've seen them amplifying crazy claims that the virus is an American biological weapon. We've seen them spreading disinformation alleging that the virus will make it impossible for Western financial institutions to honor their commitments and obligations to clients and customers. Obviously, silliness there. The bottom line for all of us is, especially in this time period, we want to be very sure of the news sources we are going to, and only accepting news and guidance from the most credible sources, not viewing our Facebook feed or our Instagram as an authoritative source of any kind of coronavirus related news. The other big risk we've seen in the last month is a huge rise in coronavirus-inspired social engineering scams. So these are cases where hackers and fraudsters are taking advantage of the panic and anxiety surrounding the pandemic, and they're using it to launch a variety of phishing and social engineering scams. These cyber criminals are, of course, manipulating our heightened sense of urgency, our hunger for information, our desire for quick solutions in this environment. And these have manifested themselves in a couple of different ways. We're seeing thousands of coronavirus-related websites cropping up, all again with the goal of launching phishing attacks, distributing malware-laced files, and trying to trick visitors into paying for fake and fraudulent items. An example, just a few weeks ago, we saw a cyber gang in Eastern Europe that was specifically targeting Italian email addresses at the height of the pandemic's outbreak in Italy, sending these Italian addresses a Word document that was purportedly from the World Health Organization, but actually had malware embedded in it that was used to infect users' machines. We're also seeing malicious apps for phones crop up, including one 2 weeks ago called Corona Live 1.1 that ingeniously included information from a legitimate coronavirus tracker, but also included spyware that could access the device's location and media files and seek permission to take photos. We've also seen tons of fraudulent charity scams over the last few weeks, quote unquote charities that have been stood up pretending to support coronavirus victims, their families, first responders, medical personnel. But really the goal here is to scam us and us into giving over our credit card information, our wire instructions. And lastly, there has been a huge surge in fake retail websites. Over 500 new sites with coronavirus sounding names, pretending to market supplements, testing kits, cures, medical devices, many of which don't even exist, and almost all of which are not for sale on any of these new fraudulent websites. And then finally, the $2.2 trillion stimulus bill passed by Congress a few weeks ago has given fraudsters a whole new set of opportunities, many of which look very similar to the IRS fraud schemes that you'll have seen around tax season. In these cases, we see scammers offering fake stimulus grants, they're launching fake loan origination sites, they're calling people, soliciting personal information, purporting to represent the government. In some cases, they're putting out threats, demanding funds of overpayment for unemployment benefits. The bottom line in all of this, again, is that we want to make sure we're getting our news from reputable and official sources. We want to be very wary of any requests to send funds quickly or scams related to the COVID-19 outbreak or the stimulus package. As always, we want to avoid clicking on links in web pages or emails. We want to make sure that if we believe a message is legitimate, that we are contacting the sending organization through confirmed channels. Especially right now, we want to be aware of, quote, investment opportunities, claiming to support companies that have developed a cure or a vaccine. Be highly skeptical of those. And then lastly, we are almost all of us now, in a work from home environment. And that means that we introduce new cyber risk in our lives. We want to be very careful of potential spoofed emails, phone calls asking for remote access to our computers. These largely have the goal of stealing our corporate data. And then lastly, virtual meetings. All of you have read the press coverage around Zoom, GoToWebinar like we're using today, other virtual meeting practices. The bottom line here is that these are about applying good hygiene, the best smart practices we can, making sure that we know who is attending our meetings, and considering password protecting our most sensitive meetings. All of these things can prevent some of the phenomenon like Zoom bombing that we've seen crop up around the country, and can prevent us from infecting each other with malware as we use these virtual meeting software. So I want to close this afternoon with some cybersecurity best practices. Again, we talked about all of you wearing many, many hats. We talked about the importance of patching and keeping our devices, our operating systems, browsers, and apps fully patched and up to date. We also talked about the risks around reusing the same password again and again. Now, I hate to say it, Margaret, but I would imagine that there is someone who's joined us this afternoon who has been using kittens25 per se as their password for the last decade for every single login. Last week, in an abundance of caution, they perhaps added an exclamation point to kittens25, and now they think they're set for the next decade. This is not a good sense of security to have. We want to make sure that for all of our logins, we are using a unique, complex password. And that's why I would recommend using a password manager app. Some of you today for this webinar are likely already doing this. These password manager apps, what they do is create for you unique, complex passwords, whether you're logging in through a browser or through an app, and then they store those passwords for you in a cryptographically sound way, so in an encrypted state. Then when you need to access those passwords, they will autofill them right into the password field for you based on either a passphrase that only you know, or even better, that biometric on your phone. Now, why do I love these so much? Well, first, they're going to give you a unique password for all of your logins. No more kittens25 everywhere all the time. They're going to give you a password that is maximally lengthy and complex. So if it's a 60-character password field, they're going to give you a 60-character password. Random alphanumerics that we as human beings could never come up with, but we don't have to remember those passwords, right? Because they're going to be auto-filled for us based on that passphrase or biometric. But it's actually the storage of our passwords that I like best about these password manager apps. Any of us today who are storing our passwords in a notes file on our phone, Word document or Excel file on our home computer, or maybe my least favorite, that Post-it note under your keyboard, these are not good places to be storing our passwords. Instead, storing them in an encrypted state in that cryptographically sound way, much safer way of doing business with the internet. All right, the next thing I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about is actually the risk around paper. And this may sound counterintuitive, but for those of us who are in the security business, there is a lot around the risk of physical paper that worries us. And those risks are in a lot of ways amplified by the current environment with coronavirus, where mail interruption is a real possibility. Being in a world where you are dependent on having to send and receive mail, either as a way of paying your bills or of doing your business, now is the time to seriously consider digitizing your lives, both the way you do business and the way you interact as individuals, because that physical paper can represent such a risk, and because mail disruption is such a real possibility in this time period. And then the last two tips that I want to leave you with this afternoon before I will turn it back to Margaret and we can take this conversation anywhere you'd like. The first is that you consider having a single standalone device that you use only for your most high consequence activities. And again, with so many of us working from home, I'm frequently getting the question of how do I make sure that my most important activities are protected when I'm using perhaps the same devices, the same network that I will tell you right now, my son is using to play video games and my daughter is using to do her social media work. So this, hence the recommendation that you have a single standalone device that you're only using for those things that are highest consequence. So this might be your work, this would be your banking, brokering, bill paying activities, and you're not using that device for any of your high risk activities. So this is the approach I have taken in my family for many years. My son is going to turn 14 tomorrow, great kid. Totally obsessed with online gaming though. Many of you, I assume, had a Fortnite problem for a while. I certainly did. We lost him for about 6 months. Now he's back. And it was never Fortnite that I worried about with his laptop. It was all of the websites that he was going to meet the other Fortniters. It was the mods and the skins and the cheats that he was downloading to help him play the game. 2 years of gaming on his gaming laptop, and that thing is literally grinding under the weight of the malware he has running on it. It is hacked. There's no question about it. But as his mom, I'll tell you, I don't really care, because I would not use my son's laptop for anything. I would not touch it with a 10-foot pole, certainly wouldn't be logging into any sensitive accounts with it, knowing how hacked it is. Likewise, my son knows that mommy's laptop is untouchable to him, only for banking and investing activities, not for any high-risk activities like social media, webmail, online shopping, or online gaming. And in this way, by physically bifurcating our high-risk activities from our high-consequence activities, we as individuals, as business owners, as corporate executives can better protect ourselves. Which leads me to my last recommendation, a highly paranoid person that I am. I have also bifurcated my network behind all of these devices, because I do not want a cyber actor pivoting through my router to get from one device to the next. In fact, when we moved to New York 3 years ago into this apartment, I insisted on 3 separate Wi-Fi networks in our apartment. One that is for my son's online gaming, my daughter's equally voluminous social media activity. It's for the Nest and the Alexa and the Google Home and the smart TV and the smart fridge. That's what we lovingly call the hacked network. I know it's on fire, but I don't care, because I'm not doing anything high consequence on it. Second network that is only for banking and investing activities, locked down under a VPN, a virtual private network, and not used for anything other than my device. My device is the only thing that connects to it, and that's the only network that that laptop connects to. And then a third network that frankly is for my guests, because I don't trust my guests. You have no idea what they're bringing onto your networks. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of you need to join me in that particularly paranoid crouch in which I'm living my life, but I do hope that all of you were able to take something away from our comments this morning, that one thing that you are going to do to run a little bit faster in the herd. So with that, Margaret, do we have any questions? What else would folks like to talk about?
Rachel, we have a ton of great questions, and that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. I think what I said earlier about you kind of both intriguing and terrifying our audience was absolutely on point based on the questions that we're getting. So I have a couple of one-word questions, and I think you'll understand this. One was Zoom ? And the other was TikTok ?
Those are great questions. So Zoom, there's a lot to like about Zoom, right? There's encryption applied. There's a lot of security around who can launch a meeting and who can't, but we do need to be applying those best practices. So that means things like locking down those meetings to only the participants you truly intend, password protecting those meetings and sending out that password so that only authorized participants can join, and then being aware of the fact that Zoom can also be a conduit of malware. If people are sending you links through Zoom, or if they're sending you attachments through Zoom, you want to be treating those with the same caution that you would treat links and attachments in an email, in a text message. You want to be highly suspicious of anything that came to you through an unsolicited channel. TikTok is an interesting one. I've got my TikTok users upstairs. And as long as we're being conscientious about where we're going and what we're doing, there's been a lot of hype around TikTok. It's outside of my particular remit, so I haven't been paying quite as much attention to the speculation around it being, a Chinese disinformation conduit. So I think the jury is still out on TikTok. We will have to see.
Okay, good answers, good answers. So another question was around keeping banking, and in this person's case, it was both a local and international banking safe, because they have collected donations and want to disperse them to charitable entities.
So this is a really good question. And so for anything that we're doing banking wise, the risks that I would be worried about would be If you're banking through any kind of online portal, making sure you're using strong authentication. So that would be a unique complex password. That would be never relying on simply that password. So leveraging the multi-factor authentication options that your local and international banks are going to give you. There's risk. We talked about the risk around paper. That certainly applies locally and internationally. And then lastly, in this current coronavirus-inspired environment, it's making sure that the charities we are giving money to are legitimate charities. So I see fraud and hacking attempted from nonprofits and charities all the time, even in the best of circumstances. This could range from a nonprofit organization that gets hacked and the hacker goes after the donor lists and then sends all of those donors emails pretending to be that charity. You click on the link in the email, you're expecting to receive it. It takes you to a website that looks just like that charity's website. You go ahead and put in your banking information. That money is now with a fraudster. And so for any of us, and it's a wonderful thing, right, who want to give money and be charitable in this current environment, it's just making sure that we're sending the money truly to the charity that we intend and that that charity is legitimate.
Okay, great. Another question that we received, and this was not from me, but it could have been. How do you know that the suggested software updates are legitimate?
So this is a really good question because certainly there have been historical examples of fake software updates being pushed that were in fact malicious. So this is why it's always worth checking. So for instance, if you are an iPhone user and you get what appears to be an update, now Apple's going to send that to you in the way that you're expecting, but it can't hurt to go ahead and do a second check that said, did Apple in fact release the latest version of iOS today? If based on their release schedule they did, you can feel pretty good about this. The other thing that we recommend though, Margaret, is that you set up auto updates for your devices. So instead of you having to determine whether a software update is legitimate, you simply let your MacBook, your Windows desktop receive auto updates automatically from their software providers. Then you're not having to be in that vetting process at all, and you know that you're going to be fully patched and up to date.
Fantastic. This is something I'm not familiar with, but maybe because of the reference to California, but there was something called the California Consumer Privacy Act that was enacted in January, and our audience member was asking your thoughts on that.
So we certainly are paying a lot of attention to all of the new privacy legislation that's coming out. So certainly California's got theirs, there's a similar bill in Massachusetts, and then of course all of Europe now with their GDPR laws. Privacy is a big deal. I think all of this stuff, frankly, is great because this is exactly the sort of thing that we as consumers need to be paying attention to and need to have companies protecting for all of us. It introduces some complexity. So certainly for those on joining our webinar today who have, as a result of their corporate relationships, access to individuals' private information, we all recognize that all of this legislation creates complexity because every single one of these laws is a little bit different than every other single one of these laws. That said, in my view, this is all progress. It's good stuff.
Okay, good. Someone asks if home firewalls are effective.
So in most cases now, your home router is going to have firewalls built in. You will have some ability to configure those firewalls yourself. And depending on which router you have, certainly modern, newer routers are better about this. It is worth going ahead and looking at your firewall configuration settings through your router and making those as strong as you can make them. Other advice in this space would be to make sure that you have changed the default password on your router. It's generally shipped with a manufacturer default password. You want to go ahead and change that password and you want to make it something complex and unique. And then the last piece of advice I have around routers is that you go ahead and this is the FBI's recommendation, that you go ahead and reboot them every couple weeks because most of the router malware that we see, malware that's built for routers, is what we call non-persistent, which means after a reboot, you've wiped it away. And so as a means of keeping your routers cleaner than usual, in addition to leveraging those firewall settings, it's rebooting them every 2 weeks can be a good best practice.
Okay, great. And then what additional security for email do you recommend aside from kind of the traditional virus protection packages available?
So certainly using an antivirus product, as you just mentioned, Margaret, we think that's a really important thing. I'm good with any of the reputable products, although we do think this is an example of where buying American is a good idea. And that means specifically avoiding maybe some of the Russian antivirus products that have a history of maybe stealing information from your computer. So sticking to the reputable antivirus products, employing strong authentication technology. So again, strong passwords, not using just a password, recognizing that that email account does contain a whole bunch of lucrative information about you, and then being very conscientious about what you click on in email, recognizing that, that emails from unsolicited sources could contain malware in an attachment, and that as much as your email provider is going to do their best to skim off those potentially malicious emails, we as consumers still have an obligation to try to protect ourselves in that space by simply thinking before we click. That can go a long way. Last piece of advice I would give you in this space, I generally advise people to steer clear of the unsubscribe button in any email they receive. Sometimes we see hackers, they will send you these phishing emails trying to get you to click on something. You're being very, very diligent, not clicking on the bad things they're sending you. And so their next tactic is just to flood you with so much email that you are tempted to hit that unsubscribe button as a means of reducing that bandwidth constraint you're feeling. That unsubscribe button can cause two different problems. One, it can actually increase the volume of the spam you're receiving, because what you've done in clicking it is confirmed that there is in fact a human being on the other end. And so now your email address is far more valuable to hackers because you verified that someone is actually reading the emails that come into that box. The other risk is that the link that is that unsubscribe button could take you to a website that is serving up malware or trying to steal your information. And so again, we recommend just deleting those emails and avoiding the unsubscribe button.
Fantastic advice. And I had heard that a while ago. So whenever someone talks about hitting unsubscribe, I get that audible gasp. No, don't do it. Okay, another question. Well, actually, there were a couple of questions around malware. One was, how do you know if you have it? And then someone asks, if someone did have malware in the past, even getting to the point of, a hacker calling them, is there information still out there even if they disposed of the device?
So really good questions. And so in terms of malware, how to know that you have it can be difficult to tell. So a lot of the things that are out there in terms of, oh, your device will be hot, or your device's power will run down faster. Those things have been true historically, but they're not invariably true. And so this is an example of where a pound of, ounce of prevention is really worth a pound of cure. And this means doing the right things up front. So avoiding those high risk behaviors on the same devices that you're using for your high consequence activities, avoiding those links that or attachments from unsolicited sources, running that antivirus product, keeping your device fully patched and up to date. If you do all of those things, you're reducing that risk of a malware infection in the first place. If you do think you have an infection, going ahead and running that software update, making sure you're on the latest version, and then making sure your antivirus product is fully up to date, those would be the things that we would recommend.
Okay. I think we may have had a true confession, because someone wrote, kittens 25, oh no. But another legit question that we had was, can a password manager get hacked?
So this is a really good question, and it's part of why I would tell you maybe 3 years ago, I was not yet comfortable recommending password manager apps, because I really wanted to see those companies and that technology bake fully before we started using them at scale. But now I'm very comfortable. That's in part because it's so much better than the alternatives in terms of securing your passwords and generating unique, complex passwords, infinitely better than kittens 25 everywhere all the time written down on that Post-it. The other reasons, though, that I'm comfortable, so these password manager apps, the industry leading ones, they're doing a variety of things because they recognize that security is existential to their business model. Business folks on this webinar today will all understand this. Any of these companies get hacked and have clients, customers lose data, lose money as a result, that is a game over scenario for them. Security is in their DNA, it's in their ethos, because it is why they exist. So they're very, very invested in this. And to that end, they do things like hire external penetration testing firms. So hire former, current hackers to try to hack into their systems, their networks, to try to steal their data, to help them identify flaws and vulnerabilities. The other thing that the best ones do is set up something that's called a bug bounty. And I really like when companies do this. The bug bounty is essentially a global pledge that says, hey, if you can find a vulnerability or a flaw in my system, I'm going to pay you to tell me about it. You come tell me about it. You don't have to exploit it. I'm going to give you money just to tell me about it. And there are people making a living all over the world now, finding security flaws and vulnerabilities, reporting them, and getting paid. And that's a great thing. The last thing in terms of the security of password manager apps, and this maybe is the most important thing, there have been examples in the last 2 years of these password manager companies being hacked. But because of the way that your credentials, your passwords are encrypted, either in their secure cloud or on-prem, even if the company is hacked, the hacker still cannot break into your passwords. And so even though maybe company data has been compromised, employee data, we've not seen a single example where a hack of a password manager company has actually yielded any of the passwords that were being stored there.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, they're
That's
doing a good
super.
job.
Yeah. Okay, so another question was, and I'm not too familiar with this, but internet browsing in dark or private mode, is that safer?
So it depends what risk you're worried about. So these are things like private mode, incognito mode. What these do is prevent your browser from storing your cookies and all of that history around your browsing activities. And so if you are someone who is concerned about privacy, who is concerned about profiling of your web browsing activities, then certainly browsing in one of these anonymous modes can be a way of preventing the internet from, in the aggregate, being able to see your patterns. Those of us, though, who tend to use things like anonymous or incognito mode, there's also downsides to those. There's some goodness in terms of usability with having your browser know where you've been and what your patterns look like. So certain aspects of multi-factor authentication become really difficult when you're browsing in those modes. But yes, in general, if you're someone who's concerned about security and privacy, it can be a great way to go.
Okay, great. And here's another question about recent legislation, or maybe it's pending legislation, about the end-to-end messaging encryption. Apparently it's at the federal level.
So there's been a lot of talk around end-to-end encryption of messaging because, of course, there are aspects, there's some of us who would say that the right to privacy is a foundational human right, and that being able to communicate in a way that we know is truly secure and encrypted is part of that human right. There's the other side of the argument that says the government needs to be able to do its job in the form of filing warrants and executing search orders. And if the communications are encrypted to the point where the company that you would normally serve that warrant to cannot actually respond with the information that you are legally asking for, with the judge's permission, that's the debate of, who is this about? Preventing perhaps terrorism in the form of the government being able to read encrypted messages versus defending the rights of the citizens who have that right to privacy. So it's a really interesting debate that's going on right now.
Fascinating. Our next question is, I'm going to combine a couple of questions together because someone asked about protecting their iPhone, but then a general question about cell phones is that a safer or a riskier device to be conducting business on?
Really good question. So I think there's a lot to like about using your mobile device for the things that matter most to you. So if you think about and I'm totally agnostic whether you're an iPhone person or an Android person, as long as you are fully patched and up to date, I feel good about your phone. The things to like about it is that, of course, the mobile network, that LTE channel on your phone is end-to-end encrypted. So if you're worried about your communications in transit, being on the mobile network can be much safer than being on, say, that open public Wi-Fi hotspot that you didn't have to use any password to get into and you have no sense of whether it's encrypted. So I like it from a network perspective. We also like apps on your phone because they're what we call sandboxed, meaning they can't talk to each other. So even if a hacker were to gain remote access to your phone, further going in and breaking into your apps is actually quite a non-trivial task. So if you're fully patched, you're on the mobile network, you're using apps that are sandboxed from each other, lots to like about the security of our mobile devices. That said, a few tips in this space. First, we want to make sure that we are only downloading apps from our designated app stores. So for Android folks, that's going to be Google Play. For iPhone folks, that's the App Store, not from third-party app stores, not from websites, not from pop-ups, links, and text messages or emails. Those third-party apps are much more likely to be malicious, much more likely to be Marcher, the malware we talked about today, than the ones that have been curated in your designated app store. Once we have those apps on our phones, we want to make sure we only give them the permissions they truly need. I'll tell you, no good is going to come from giving an app access to your photos if it does not need access to your photos. We want to keep those permissions locked down. And then lastly, we want to be conscientious about how and where we are charging our mobile devices. That means steering clear of publicly available charging cords and publicly available data connection ports, like the ones you find in airports. This is the Uber driver who says, hey, want to charge your phone using my cord? The answer is no, right? You want to avoid having a data connection, the provenance of which you don't know, into your phone. These can be used to either inject malware onto your device or to silently exfiltrate the data off of your device. Don't want to see that happen.
Fantastic. I'm going to pose one last question, and I apologize if anyone, if we didn't get to your question today, Rachel, I'll share them with you afterward, and maybe you can get me some additional answers. But I think a good closing question for today will be relevant to everyone, and this came in a couple of different variations, so I'm combining these comments, and it basically is, what are sources of trustworthy information on this topic, other than you?
So there are, fortunately, a lot of really good sources out there. So the government has multiple websites that speak to these best practices. The FBI website, the Department of Homeland Security, CISA's website, all have great cybersecurity best practices for individuals, for companies. They're publishing notices all of the time. They have been a great source of information for all of us over the last month as we've seen this upswing in coronavirus-related cyber attacks. So we think any of those government websites are good sources of true facts in this case. We also think there's some great security research going on. So whether that's at some of the cybersecurity firms that are building security products and antivirus products that we're of course using to help defend all of us and ourselves and our businesses, but they're also publishing great research about the tradecraft and the tactics that hackers are using. For those of us who are junkies for this and just kind of spend our whole day reading and trying to build compensating controls and countermeasures for all of it, there's a lot out there, but it's avoiding some of those sources that are much more likely to be disreputable, sticking to the credible blogs, the people who really have expertise in this space. There certainly is a lot of snake oil out there in this environment, and it's recognizing that we're seeing that snake oil when we see it. It's a great question.
Well, fantastic. Well, this has been a really dynamic discussion, and I just want to thank you and as well our audience who came up with great questions. And in closing, I'm just going to say that I want to remind everyone who's listening that the RBS Virtual Lunch and Learn series takes place monthly. Since its inception, we've tried to make it easy for you to remember by consistently scheduling in the middle of each month, the middle of the week, and the middle of the day. However, in response to emerging issues, you'll notice that we occasionally supplement that cadence with additional webinars to remain informative on a timely basis. For more information, you can always visit our webpage, business.rutgers.edu/alumni/lifelong-learning. We have an exciting schedule of topics and presenters lined up over the next several months thanks to the suggestions of our audience, so we encourage you to keep sharing your great ideas. We want the series to continue to meet your needs. So please stay online for just a moment as today's webinar ends, because you'll immediately see a brief 3-question survey about today's event, and one of those is a free-form field to type in topics and/or speakers you'd like to see in featured in future webinars. And finally, as I mentioned when our webinar began, a link to the archived recording of this presentation will be emailed to you. It will be posted on social media, and it'll also be on the Business Insight page of our website. So thank you, Rachel, And thank you everyone who joined us. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and stay healthy. Take care.